Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Milestones podcast. I ruined my long streak of actually posting weekly on Thursdays because I've been away a lot this month. I was away the last 2 weekends and they were road trips, so I was driving for a lot of it and I was unable to record podcasts. And I've also just kind of been busy with like personal stuff, like just personal struggles with like mental health and physical health, and then also business stuff and just keeping my life together with like work and doing the horse chores and the basics. So I just haven't really had it in me to record a podcast. But I'm back now and I wanted to kind of do like just a generalized one, I guess, talking about life and like general things that are going on with that, and like not my year end recap yet. I think I'm going to record that one next week or the following week as like the end of the year type podcasts like I do, where it's like a year end recap that just kind of goes over the goings on in the year and stuff like that. But this one, I kind of just wanted to do more of like a mental health type podcast and just talking about some of the stuff that's been going on in the world and just like day to day life stuff and just societal stuff and like how that kind of impacts how we show up for our horses and all of that jazz. And just do that because it's kind of cathartic for me to talk about these things as well, because it just allows me to process them and kind of share my feelings with people who might be feeling the same things but don't necessarily know how to put words to them. And even like as I'm doing this, I'm still kind of like finding ways to put words to them, because like for me, sometimes I don't necessarily have like full awareness of how I'm actually feeling at any given moment until I start to talk about it and try to like explain it. And then I'll be like, okay, wait, like I don't actually know. And I think that goes for a lot of people because honestly, like in many cases, when you're just trying to survive and like where you're feeling bad about things and you still have to go to work and you still have to pay your rent and you still have to keep like a roof over your head and you still have to do all of these like everyday tasks that you have to accomplish. Otherwise, you're going to lose access to basic human needs. Like you kind of have to shove down how you're really feeling in order to cope with all of that. And first of all, like, I don't think we should have to do that. It's a very, very unhealthy aspect of human society. But all of that aside, like, the reality is that unless you have like a really intense support network that is financially able to support you, generally speaking, that's what most people have to do if they're struggling in a way that is kind of consuming them. You kind of have to shove those feelings down and like disassociate and just push on through. And doing that chronically kind of leads you inevitably to burnout because like the emotions are still there, the feelings are still there, the fatigue is still there, whether you're like openly feeling it or not, it's still there. You can't just ignore it. It's not one of those things where it's like, oh, if you ignore it, it'll go away. No, it won't. If you ignore it, it becomes bottled up and it can manifest into a much larger issue in the future. And it's one of those things too, where even when it does become those issues, it's oftentimes hard for people to link it back to them suppressing emotions and the mental health component of it. Because if it manifests as a physical issue, sometimes people are more likely to attribute that to something else. So if you have like an autoimmune disorder that you develop, you're going to attribute it to something else, even though it can absolutely be related to chronic stress. If you get sick all the time, you might not necessarily link it to your emotions and the emotional suppression and burnout and whatnot. So when it does catch up with us, we don't necessarily source it to what actually may have caused it. And societally, that's just a huge problem because, like, with mental health in general, I do think that there is incentive from like human societal aspects to not fully clarify the full extent that like mental health can impact your physical health and how many health issues and problems in the world are actually heavily contributed to by poor mental health. And I think the reason for that is if the research was done and published to the extent that it should be, it would give very, very clear evidence that the way that humans are being made to work and like be productive for like a capitalistic aspect, it would give hard evidence that that is not healthy or sustainable or fair to people, and it would show how much harm it is actually causing. So I think that there is incentive for that to kind of be hidden and not fully exposed to the extent that it should be. And I also think that that's why there's such like a gap between how physical and mental health is perceived, where a lot of countries, even if there is universal health care, like here in Canada, like mental health services aren't included in that. So if you want to go to a psychologist or if you want counseling, you're largely paying that out of pocket, or you have to pay for extra insurance to get some form of coverage, when really like your brain is the control center of the body. So it's the most wild thing to me, because it's like the most important aspect of who you are as a person and like to keep your body running. And yet it's one of the greatest failings that we see societally and in healthcare. And it's interesting to me because it's like, we know that the head is important, because it's always like, protect your head, wear a helmet. Head injuries are bad. They can cause lifelong issues. And like, people are well aware of the physical issues that can happen if you hit your head and your brain is damaged from that. But then there is a lack of honesty involved when we're talking about how chronic stress can damage the brain and how it can impact how the brain functions too, because it's less visible. Like if you fall and you hit your head, that's like a very visible, outwardly obvious incident where there has been like an outward trauma, but then we're not having the same focus and fixation on how like inward trauma can damage the brain and how like environmental traumas can damage the brain. Because I think that as a whole, like the human experience, like a lot of people are going through a collective trauma, and that's like what burnout is. And that's what the prioritization of capital and like making money and making rich people money, it's a trauma for the people who are having to participate in that, but aren't seeing the benefits in the same way that the people at the top are. And we're all essentially like cogs in a big machine that is essentially grinding out our energy and our worthiness to create wealth for other people at the expense of the health of many, many people. And it's really screwed up if you look at it. Like honestly, I kind of fluctuate between looking really deeply at like the gravity of the situation and just like how societally diseased humans are as a species, and like how much sickness there is in the way that we function in the world and how we've decided to run things. I fluctuate between looking at it really clearly and just feeling like overwhelmed by that realization and wanting to just kind of ignore it and feeling helpless. And I think like the ignoring it is a protective mechanism to try to escape the anxiety and the helplessness and just the general stress that is associated with feeling those feelings and looking at things in that very stark manner. But also, I would say looking at it honestly and just admitting the fact that, like, okay, this isn't healthy. This isn't normal. This isn't how people are meant to live. This isn't the way that things should be. I do think that in a way that that's very freeing, and it does make me feel better. Sorry, my kitten is running around by the microphone, so that might have had some noises. But it's freeing to admit that, and it makes you feel less alone, because otherwise, okay, so you need to stop. Otherwise, you're left with basically just blaming yourself and being like, why can't I keep up with this? Why am I so tired? Why am I so depressed? Why am I so lethargic? Why don't I want to do the things that I love anymore? Why am I so angry? Why am I so anxious? Why am I so frustrated? Why can't I do this? And you start to go into this self-blaming aspect, when really it's like, no, the reason why you are struggling is because things shouldn't be this way, because the world is messed up. And honestly, I would say the most normal response that people could have to the way that things are is to be upset by it, is to be depressed by it, is to have it bother them on a fundamental level, because it is bad. It would be a more abnormal response to be living in this chaos and in this unfairness and in this sickness in society and be completely comfortable and okay with it. Like, that is actually what is the abnormal response. Like, I would say as a whole, mental illness like anxiety and depression and whatnot is a normal response to the way the world is running right now, because we're having to see like masses of people be harmed at the hands of powerful governments who are living in developed countries, who are the richest countries in the world, and having them play it off as just being like self-defense and whatnot. We're having these very developed countries have people living on the streets and dying in the winter from the cold and not getting their basic needs met, and we're having to witness that and be told that that's normal. And it isn't. Like, you should be impacted by that. You should be upset by that, because if you look at humans as a species, like, we're a cooperative, community-oriented social species. Like, we are made to function as a collective and to help out each other. And like, we tend to be compassionate. And I think that the lack of empathy that we see on such a wide scale now is something that has been manufactured unnaturally, and it's not actually a natural component of who people are. They have just learned how to turn off that part of themselves as a self-protective mechanism, because if you keep that compassion and you keep that empathy while you look around and see all the unfairness in the world, it is a massive, massive burden to carry, and it wears you down and it tires you out, and you can't hold it easily. Like, it takes its wear and tear on you, and it will damage your physical and mental health, just that level of awareness. So trying to erase that empathetic component within you can help alleviate some of that burden, but at what cost, right? Because like, getting rid of that empathy means that you're no longer caring about other people or feeling as deeply as what you could be. And so like, looking around and being like not okay with the way that things are right now, not okay in your life, like, rather than allowing it to make you feel like a failure, like, I would acknowledge the fact that that is a very, very normal reaction to the way the world is running right now. It really is. Being bothered by it, being upset by it, being incredibly sad, incredibly anxious, being worried about the direction that things are headed, like, those are all really normal reactions. The apathy, the lack of care, the lack of empathy, the lack of concern for other people is an abnormal reaction. And that's the thing that we should be looking at. And this kind of goes into what I've said before in other podcasts about people using "you're so sensitive" as like an insult, or like trying to frame it as a bad thing. And it's not the sensitivity that's the problem. It's the insensitivity, because at its core, the entire issue that the people who say like "you're so sensitive" and who complain about things like, oh, like woke culture, what they're actually mad about is being held accountable for how their behavior is negatively impacting other people. And they're trying to make you the problem so that they can get away with being shitty to other people scot-free, and not have to actually have to sit with like how inconsiderate their actions are. Because insensitivity at its core is harming other people. Sensitivity is typically only harming yourself by being more attuned to how other people are feeling, and also to your own emotions. Like, a sensitive person is not very commonly going to be like hurting other people by being sensitive. At most, the risk that being a sensitive person poses to other people is annoying them by having your sensitivity incite guilt in them internally, or have them be put in a position where they have to reflect more heavily on their behavior. And that's not really a bad thing. It's not a mean thing. You're not being a mean person for saying like, hey, like, what you did hurt my feelings and I didn't like that. You know, like, that's not being mean. Being sensitive is not a bad thing. And like, even the term oversensitive in a lot of cases, it's used to describe people who are responding normally to situations where injustice is happening. So I think that the way we've started to frame sensitivity on like a wide scale in the community, it's used to try to mock people for caring about others and for having compassion. And it's used to make people try to feel bad about having those traits when they shouldn't. It's a good thing. You should be sensitive. If the whole world was more sensitive, we could not get away with causing the mass harm that is being caused on a worldwide scale, because people would care more about it and they would be less turned off about it. The bigger issue is the insensitivity in the world, how separated people have become from the struggle of others, and how we've kind of created this structure where it's class driven. So if you're in the upper class, like, you're dehumanizing people who are in the lower class. Like, a lot of people look at homeless people with disdain and disgust and contempt, and they look at them with just like a complete lack of patience, and they feel inconvenienced about having to witness these people who are struggling in front of them, when in reality, the only reason we have to witness people in that amount of struggle in public is because of our society's inability and unwillingness to help them. And I'm going to actually take away what I'm saying about inability, because I don't believe that it's actually an inability. It's a decided effort to place people in those positions, because we have the resources available to help them and not have them be on the street, and we're just not using them or allocating them properly. We also have a ton of scholarly research showing why people end up becoming addicted to substances, or what typical familial dynamics and life events that people who end up being homeless have gone through. And we also create homelessness by making the world run in such a way where you have to be providing capital and making money for companies and going to work in order to be viewed as deserving of having basic needs. When, if we're being really honest, like if you care about other human beings and you just think that like people deserve to be treated fairly, everyone is deserving of basic needs. You shouldn't need to be able to pay for things in order to be deserving to live. And that's essentially what it is. Like the entire concept of the cost of living is such a flawed perspective of viewing the world, because we shouldn't be having to pay money to live. It should be situations where it's like based off of someone's skill set and their ability to participate physically and mentally, that they're given different tasks. And we operate in like a community mindset where everyone does their little piece to help continue running the society. And with how things are currently, like a lot of people are being forced to work to the point of burnout just to barely make ends meet, like to barely even make their rent, because the cost of living has gone up so dramatically, but the level of compensation that people are receiving for their work hasn't gone up at the same rate. So we're being perpetually outpaced, while we have a very small fraction of people who are holding exorbitant amounts of wealth that frankly, like no one person needs to be a billionaire. And this is like a hill I will die on. No one person needs to hoard that amount of wealth. If there's people dying and starving on the street, but you have like hundreds of houses all over the world and like 50 yachts, and you're just like spending money on stupid shit like diamond plated floors in your house and like gold faucets on your sink and stuff, you're being a shitty person, because you're prioritizing having these things that are not necessary and do not dramatically increase your quality of life in any big way. You're putting like basically flexing on people to show off how rich you are above the well-being of people who don't even have enough food or clean water or shelter. And there's just no way around the fact that you cannot bask in that degree of wealth and just spending money on all of these completely unnecessary things without being a shitty person. And when I say this, I've had people come at me and be like, oh, well, like you have things you don't need. Like you don't need horses. Like you don't need to go out for dinner. You don't need to like go, I don't know, like whatever your hobbies are. You don't need to go skiing. Like I don't ski, so that's a bad one for me, but, or whatever, right? Like you don't need to spend money on things that are anything but a basic need. And it's like, technically, no. Okay, if we're going to go there, you don't need that to live. No. But why are we fixating on how people who are making peanuts in comparison to the people who are the actual problem? Why are we fixating on how those people spend their money instead of looking at like the level of wastage and just like completely outrageous spending that these people who are living at the top of society are like participating in, you know? And it's not even like referencing like millionaires. Like I'm specifically referencing like billionaires and people who just have such an absurd level of wealth that it's like any one normal person is not even going to spend $1 billion like in their entire lifetime, right? Like the average person's never going to spend that in their lifetime or even 2 lifetimes. Like it is such an absurdly high amount of money that I think part of the problem is a lot of people can't wrap their head around just how much money that is. And it leads them to defending something that actually does not serve them and in fact is harming them, because they don't understand like the degree of wealth that is even being referenced, and they feel attacked by it on the off chance that they potentially make a lot of money and become what they consider rich. But even in that like fictional belief system where it's like, I'm going to become a rich person, like they're not even, that the way they imagine things is not even being a billionaire. Because like honestly, like for me saying this, like I would be so out of my depth if I went and I hung out with a billionaire because I just wouldn't freaking understand how they function the way that they do, or like that amount of wealth, and like how they can just drop like 10 grand on like any little thing, just like they're buying like a coffee at Starbucks or something, like we wouldn't be able to wrap our heads around it. And if we were placed into that dynamic, it would be shocking to the average person, even people who grew up in rich families or what are considered to be like rich families amongst like the normal people, right? And that's just the reality of the situation. Like, it's just an absurd amount of wealth, and there's just no way that you can function in that manner in an ethical way when people are barely able to make ends meet. And there's a certain level of like dehumanization that all of these people at the height of society are participating in to try to dehumanize people who are making far, far less, like I mentioned with homeless people. And it's like a decided effort. And I've also said this in other podcasts where I think that like having homeless people exist on the streets out in the public eye, I think that it's actually like a tactical move where they're being used essentially as a threat to keep people going to work and be like, this could be you, like at least you're not them. And it gives people a very convenient group of people to look down on and mock and make fun of and feel better than when they're feeling shitty about themselves. And they can continue to do that and like just basically have a scapegoat of society to look at and be like, oh, well, at least I'm not them. And it serves as a perpetual threat. Like, you're walking by these people and it's like, oh, like I'm so exhausted, I don't want to go to work. But it's like, I want to keep a roof over my head. I don't want to end up like that. The vast majority of people, even people who are doing quite well, all things considered, are they're closer to being homeless than they are to being billionaires. Like, by far, they're closer to ending up on the streets than they are to being a billionaire. Like, even people who are like, even if you have $1 million in the bank, you're still probably closer to becoming bankrupt and ending up on the streets than you are to being a billionaire. Like, it's just absurd. So I find myself just like so frustrated with that, because like I have like a justice sensitivity where it's like when I see injustice being committed, it really bothers me, and seeing it on this dramatic level where there's just so much corruption in the world, it kind of consumes me and it creates a lot of stress. So it's like I have the day-to-day stressors in my own life of like having to pay rent, having to take care of my animals, having to like run my business, and having to do like all of these little day-to-day chores, like even like little things like doing the dishes, doing my laundry, cleaning the house. I have all of those little things to think about. And then I have these bigger things that are like largely out of my control and are being like perpetuated on like a worldwide basis that are just bothering me in the background, and it adds to all of the stress. So like what I've discussed in other podcasts on like horse behavior about trigger stacking, if we look at that with people, like there's a lot of triggers that we have stacked throughout our day-to-day life where we have these stressors that are occurring on a perpetual basis that are bothering us and are causing us pain and distress, and we have to deal with those in the background of everything else going on in our lives, and it can be all consuming and it's really hard to keep up with. And I don't think that most of us are fully honestly looking at like how tiring that is and how much it actually bothers us and wears us down, and just like how much difficulty it adds to our lives. I don't think most of us are actually honestly looking at that and really like noticing the impact it has, because honestly it's insidious. Like, it kind of sneaks up on you, and you don't really you can't really notice to what extent it's exhausting you and wearing you down unless you are like, until you've like alleviated some of that burden and you feel like how much better that you feel, right? Like, you don't notice it kind of sneaks up on you. And that's kind of where I'm feeling, where it's like throughout like I'm on like the cusp of burnout again, and like I've been trying to recover from burnout for like 7+ years now. Like, honestly, like for a huge portion of my life, like I've been trying to recover from burnout. And like for a lot of those years, I was in the midst of burnout, and I was like continuing to push myself to a point where I was just becoming more and more burnt out. And then I would go through stages where I would take some of the burden off and I would be able to rest a little bit more, but it was never enough to like fully rest and recover. So it's like, yeah, I'm not as burnt out as I used to be, but I'm still at a point where I'm at a fragile state and I haven't been able to fully rest and recover. recover. So then it's like when you pile on more tasks after that initial recovery, you're still way more fragile and likely to hit a point of burnout than what you would be if you'd been able to fully rest. And I feel like that's the state that a lot of people are in, where it's like you fluctuate between being super, super burnt out and being like a little less burnt out. And when you feel a little less burnt out, you feel to you, you're like, wow, I feel great. I feel so much better. But it's because your baseline that you're comparing it to is so bad that even like a little bit of reprieve feels so much better to you. And that's the state I think of a lot of us are existing in perpetually because we just have so many stressors going on, and it really shouldn't be this hard to live. And I've said this before too, like my generation, which like I'm technically a millennial, but I'm right on the cusp of being a millennial and Gen Z because I'm born in 1996. So it's like right smack dab on the line. But like our generations have kind of gotten screwed because we grew up being told like, oh, if you like work really hard and you get a good job and you go to school and you get an education and you just apply yourself, like you'll make good money, you'll make a good living, you'll be able to get a house, you'll be able to do all these things. And we freaking believed that. And then a lot of us have done these things, and all it has ended up in is like putting us in debt if you do go to school, and then ending up finishing that degree or whatever you do in school and not having it make you the amount of money that they assured you it would, where you're making barely more than people who did not go to school. And the interesting thing too is like, for me in particular, like at my school, like I went to school in a pretty affluent neighborhood, right? So like it was looked down on by those people who a lot of the families wanted their kids to go to post-secondary. Like going into the trades was looked down on, and it was viewed as like kind of the bottom of the barrel, or being like less successful, or for the kids who were like less good at school or like whatever. But honestly, like a lot of the people who did go into trades ended up doing better because they're getting paid more than many people who went to school. And it's like, but even then, like even people who are making well above minimum wage, it's still hard to make ends meet because of how much the cost of living have gone up. Like I truly do not understand how people are affording to live and like pay rent on minimum wage, especially in my area, because I just don't understand how you could afford to pay rent and like pay for food and pay for your car and pay for gas, because like even just paying rent is basically your whole paycheck. And and that it's just like, it's absurd. Like I don't understand how people do it, and it shouldn't be that way, because minimum wage was supposed to be the minimum wage that like one person could provide for a family, and that's not the case. And yeah, so it's just like it's just like it shouldn't be this way. So it's very stressful. And like honestly, this is a stage I'm in where like I'm in a personal state of burnout because of all the stuff I've had. And anyways, like I feel like we're kind of on the cusp of some major shifts in the world, because people are hitting the point where they're getting very frustrated with how things have been going. And I feel like we're on the cusp where it's like we're at the precipice of major change. And for me, like I do find it a little bit exciting because it boasts the promise of like a better world, but it's also going to be very scary because I think there's going to be a lot of casualties, like be it like literally in terms of people dying, or just like stuff happening that impacts all of us. I think that there's going to be a lot of casualties in the lead up to that, and it's just going to be chaotic. But like it's something that I do feel needs to happen in order to bring about major change, because we haven't successfully brought about major change, especially to the world order and like people in positions of power, without having to like take action. Like asking nicely and pointing out the problems hasn't worked, because you're still easy enough to ignore. And like I think that's the thing, is like the sad reality is like a lot of people just simply don't care about anyone that's not in their inner circle, like especially the people who are front running all of these issues and like who are causing these problems and creating the type of world we live in, where people are having to work so hard and see so little in return. They don't really care about our struggles or the stressors that like the everyday person is facing. So you can't really appeal to them using ethics and morals and trying to appeal to their empathy, because they don't have empathy for people like us. Like it's one of those things where I think a lot of these people, like the billionaires and a lot of politicians and people in positions of power, until they are actually personally impacted by the same things that they are perpetuating on other people, I don't think that they'll care. They're only going to see the true gravity of it when it's them being impacted. And when it is them, they're going to feel like it's a huge injustice. Like a great example of this actually would be regardless of how anyone feels about this, like I'm going to clarify how I feel, but like the recent CEO shooting of the United Healthcare CEO with Luigi Mangione as the shooter. So shout out. And before someone says that I'm mean for like cheerleading the death of someone, I'm going to explain why it is that I don't care about that in this particular case, despite being a highly empathetic person. The reason why I don't care is that these people have caused, like, directly been responsible for the deaths of thousands of people just to line their own pockets, and they haven't cared. And now, like, at a societal level, like, the government and, like, the legal system wants us to see this as this huge injustice and this big outrage and something that is so not okay, and that where the perpetrator deserves to be punished so heavily. But there isn't consistency in that mindset that is being equally applied to everyone. There's been so many instances where we've seen people commit hate crimes, and we're like even within the legal system where we've seen police enact violence on Black people who are completely innocent and end up killing them or severely hurting them and get off scot-free for that. We've seen like tons and tons of people commit mass murders, particularly in the US with like school shootings, and they aren't labeled as terrorists in the way that Luigi was by killing one person. And so I look at the complete disconnect in terms of how people are viewing this particular situation where a very rich person at like the top of society happened to be murdered, how differently that is being perceived and talked about by the media and within the legal world and by governments, etc., how differently they are referencing it compared to all of the other people who were lower class that have died in very unfair ways at the hands of the government or at the hands of the people that the government has supported. Like, for example, Kyle Rittenhouse, that kid that just showed up at a protest and like unloaded a gun on multiple people, never got punished for it and was actually hailed a hero and was like invited to the White House and stuff and like was treated like a freaking celebrity. And then we have someone who has killed an objectively bad person who's now being labeled as a terrorist, even when school shooters haven't been referred to in that same way. So there's just a lot of hypocrisy and a lack of consistency that I think paints a very clear picture of like how your status in terms of what class you're a part of influences how people see you and whether or not you're viewed as much of a person as everyone else. And I think that there hasn't been a very stark way in this situation that has displayed that lack of consistency across like all people being viewed as people as this situation has, because it exposes a very big gap in terms of how people are treated and how society views them and how much unfairness and inequality there actually is, and just how deliberate that is. Like the news coverage and the general perspective that is being applied on this by the ruling class is exposing a huge rift in terms of how people are protected and how they're viewed and how their humanity is viewed, and just how much upper class, like rich people, especially white people, are protected and viewed and held onto this pedestal to far greater extent than anyone else. So I feel like anyways, we're hitting a point where it's becoming harder and harder to deny and ignore the intentions of people who are setting laws and enforcing them, and just generally how like the average person, everyday person who is not super wealthy, how they're viewed in our society. Like there's just been a magnifying glass that's been put onto those situations in so many different ways, in like multiple high profile occurrences over the years. And like this recent one is one of the most potent examples of that, because it's just really interesting to see how the media is portraying this versus like how the everyday person is reacting. Like largely a lot of people are seeing like this as like a win in terms of ethics and justice, because it's just putting into perspective like how life is not valued equally. Because if it were, the entire concept of for-profit healthcare could not exist, because we wouldn't view it as acceptable to make it so that people who cannot afford to pay the bill are less able to access life-saving services. We wouldn't withhold basic needs such as medical care from people unless they could afford it. And obviously this is like a very specific thing to like the US and like just other countries that don't have universal access to healthcare. However, like if human life was actually sacred and valued to the extent it should be, there wouldn't be such inequality in terms of how it's viewed. So I don't know. I think that that's put a magnifying glass on how our world is actually functioning and just the level of like lack of empathy towards the everyday person and how we are expected like collectively as a society to care about these people who don't care about us. And like I used to kind of be like, oh, we need to care about everybody and like killing is bad no matter what. But I'm at the point where it's like if someone doesn't give a shit about whether or not me and my family and like those close to me and people like me are safe, happy, and healthy, like why should I care about them? Especially if they are like directly responsible for taking away people's safety and directly responsible for harming them. Because like with that said, like it's like there's people who don't like me and who wish harm on me that I wouldn't wish harm back on. But if they're directly responsible for causing harm to masses of people, then I'm not gonna like shed a tear if something happens to them, because in my perspective, I think that's a karmic response from the universe where it's like they're getting a taste of their own medicine and getting to feel the sadness, fear, lack of safety, and lack of support that so many of us feel at the hands of like how the world is run in their favor. So yeah, I don't really care about those people. And I think that like in terms of like having the type of revolution the world needs to create a more empathetic society that's actually serving everyone and isn't just like exploiting the world's resources to the extent of like killing people and like the entire natural world around it, I do think that it's going to take big movements like what has recently happened and what will, I think, continue to happen, because the people in power haven't had to feel fearful of the people that they're governing, and they should, because there's more of us than there are of them. And they shouldn't be able to make decisions that are harming the people that they're trying to claim they're protecting and serving without recourse from those people. Because that's the thing, is we shouldn't be running the world in a way where it's serving to function just to line the pockets of a select few at the expense of the many. I don't know. That's a hill I'll die on. So it's something that I've been thinking a lot recently, especially with the CEO shooting and just like some of the protests that have been going on and just like the disarray that the world has seen, like especially within like the last like 3 or 4 years. Like I would say with the pandemic starting, like there is just a really big shift in like how people are seeing the world. And it just feels like those last 4 years have had so much stuff happening that honestly, it feels like it's been like a decade. Like I can't believe that 2020 was almost 5 years ago now, because it feels like it was like much, much longer than that, because just so much stuff has happened. Like I feel like I've lived like 3 lifetimes in that time. So it's just wild to me how much ongoing things are continuing to just like add to like the degree of like chaos in the world. So anyone that's having a hard time functioning in the midst of that, I'd say that's a very normal response. And I've been finding that for myself, where it's like with working and trying to like save money and like do things to set up my life, I'm doing it and I'm kind of like, okay, like, yeah, I need to do this because it's like, I need to be able to afford to live. But it's like, when you're looking into the future for like long-term goals, like me being like, I want to get a farm and stuff and like working towards that, I'm kind of looking at it now and being like, in some ways feeling like, what's the point? Because like, is there going to be anything there for me to even have? Like, for example, if costs keep rising, like, am I ever going to be able to afford to do that? Or am I going to be constantly outpaced? Or even if I can afford it, is there even going to be like healthy land to purchase? Or like, how long is the world going to have to survive once I'm able to do that? So it kind of feels like running a race that has no finish line and not having as much to look forward to because of that. So it's hard, because it's like you can have these lifelong goals that you've had since you were very, very young. And then as you get older and you just see like the corruption and unfairness of things around you, you still have those goals deeply set in your soul, but you're kind of sitting there like, is this even realistic? Like, is there even going to be anything there for me? Or is this like a pipe dream? And like, what am I doing? Like, so I'm trying to find like a happy medium between like doing all the things that I need to do to set up the life that I want and to be able to like afford to live and do those things, but then also trying to find like little ways to bring myself joy in the midst of all the chaos. So like hiking lots, going outside, like hanging out with my animals, finding like new activities that I like and trying to just find like ways to escape from the chaos and like just being like completely immersed in just like realizing how much corruption there is in the world. And like the scary thing is like even with the realizations I've had, like I know that it's only the tip of the iceberg. And in some ways, like I don't even want to know the full extent of it because I think it would be very, very scary to actually fully realize that and just like see how fucked up everything is. So in some ways, it's like nice to be protected from some of that, but at the same time, it's like I do want to operate with a certain level of awareness so that it's not as easy to like control me and like kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? Like calm down my response and just like, yeah, like repress any frustration response from me and like kind of just like spoon feed me information. That's what I want to hear. And like just stop me from questioning the status quo. So it's like finding the balance between like being aware, but not being consumed by that awareness and like still being able to like enjoy life and find things that make me happy. And yeah, not letting it completely eat away at my soul. And yeah. So anyways, this podcast has kind of gone very like anarchist and anti-capitalist, which I feel like a lot of my podcast episodes kind of go in that direction. But I do think it's important because I think it gives context to like how I've been feeling. Because honestly, it isn't just about like stuff that's like solely personally like impacting me in my direct life. It's about like the bigger picture around me and like how that's been making me feel. And like that being in the background combined with all the stuff I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis has been quite difficult. So it's valid and relevant. And I think more people need to kind of think about it that way because even if you're not like fully like immersing yourself and learning about all the goings on around you, even just like seeing a news article that you find upsetting and trying to like push it down, it's still there in the background, you know, and like the emotions that it evokes are still there with you. And we need to be more conscious of that, where it's like just because you try to ignore something doesn't mean that the impact that it had on you and that it continues to have on you isn't still there because it still affects us and how we feel. So I've been trying to be more conscious of how things have been impacting me internally and like feeling my feelings and being outraged and frustrated by things that I rightfully should be, while being like honest with myself about like how I'm feeling internally. Cause I've kind of come to the realization as I've grown older that I've been very like out of touch with my body and like my emotions. And that like there's been a lack of connection between mind and body and just like a lack of awareness of like how I'm actually truly feeling internally, to the point where like I'll get like bodily signals that are tied to certain emotions and I won't necessarily know what they are or what they mean, or where I'll start like engaging in certain behaviors and I won't even notice like the feelings behind it. Like a great example that I have of this actually from recently is I was just like sitting on the couch hanging out with some friends and I got a notification on my Apple Watch that my heart rate was at like 150 and I was just like sitting still. And like 150 is like higher than it goes when I'm like vigorously exercising. So it was like very weird. And I was like basically having a panic attack as I sat on the couch, and I wasn't consciously aware of that even happening until the watch buzzed me. And then I could feel like my heart rate racing and like the tightness in my chest and like the shortness of breath. And I became aware of it because of that. But like at the time, like I was suppressing that feeling and the awareness of that feeling to such an extent that I had absolutely no idea that that was happening until I got buzzed on my watch, which shouldn't be happening because I should be more in touch with how I'm feeling internally on a day-to-day basis, where it isn't a situation where I'm sitting there like that and not aware of the fact that I'm literally having a panic attack. And that was kind of an eye-opener for me, where I'd had an idea where it was like, I know that I've kind of been like dissociated from my emotions like a lot over the years. And it's been like a coping mechanism, like kind of what I mentioned earlier, where it's like I still need to go about my life. And if there's like a lot of factors and traumas and stressors going on in the day to day that are out of my control and that I can't make go away. Like you still have to try to like go to school, like especially like when I was younger, it's like I'm still going to school and I'm like at the mercy of like the situations that my family puts me in and like what we're dealing with, right? And I still just had to cope and deal with it. So like while I was going through all these developmental stages, I learned to kind of dissociate from how I was actually feeling emotionally in order just to get through the day to day. And that's something that has followed me into adulthood for sure. And something that I'm trying to like consciously unlearn and just become more aware of like how I'm feeling in the moment and become more present, which is particularly difficult. Like if you have ADHD, because already it's like your mind is so busy that it's very, very hard to like be present, and like especially in like a meditative sense, because your mind is constantly thinking of things. So it's hard enough as it is, but when you've used it as a means of like escaping from difficult situations and kind of like avoiding and running from your feelings, it becomes a habit, and it becomes even harder to kind of not continue to sink into that type of coping mechanism because it is unhealthy. Like it's emotional suppression. It's running from your emotions. And if you're suppressed the emotions, your nervous system's never able to like feel them and work its way through them to regulate properly. And like, honestly, this is probably a large part of the reason why I've had such chronic anxiety, is because I haven't actually been feeling my emotions. So I've been trying to become more consciously aware of it, but it's hard to do when you don't even realize that you're suppressing emotions in the first place. And I've gotten better at catching it in certain circumstances, but that situation with my Apple Watch was kind of an eye opener where I like had to pause for a moment and I was like, okay, wait, like that is crazy. That is really weird. I can't believe I didn't notice that. Thank you so much for tuning into the Making Milestones podcast this week. If you are interested in ways that you can help support the podcast, it would be greatly appreciated if you would leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help to promote the podcast in the algorithm, allowing me to connect with new listeners, and it is so greatly appreciated. Some other ways you can help to support the podcast include subscribing to my Patreon channel, where you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month and access monthly Q&As, behind-the-scenes content, training help, and more. Every subscription helps, and they help to offset any costs associated with the podcast, allowing me to keep most of these episodes ad-free. I also have an online store where I sell equestrian athletic apparel, graphic t-shirt and hoodie designs, horse bridles, both bitted and bitless, and you can check that out in the podcast description as well. Lastly, I have my main website where I have a bunch of webinars with different types of training topics, and where I also offer online training consultations if you want a one-on-one appointment with me. All of this helps me continue doing what I'm doing, and your support is so appreciated.